Hello, and welcome to our presentation on Rural Considerations in Deflection. Today's presenters are Jack Charlier, Executive Director, Guy Farina, Senior Program Manager, and Sydney Goggins, Deflection Program Manager of TASC's Center for Health and Justice, an international nonprofit that specializes in practical, local, and collaborative solutions at the intersection of public safety and public health. Jack, Guy, Sydney, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here with you. Let me begin by first saying thank you to the Fletcher Group, our colleagues there up and down the ladder who do such great work in rural communities across the United States, and of course in putting on webinars and events like today. We're pleased to be here with you. So thank you to the Fletcher Group, and thank you to all of you who have joined us today for what will be a very good hour together that will leave you with something that you can go and do and work on in deflection in your rural community. So thank you for joining us today. We'll get going with the first presentation, which is my part, and then on to Guy, and then to Sydney, and then we'll get a chance for some Q&A. Next slide, please. Here's our agenda for today. Introductions. Of course, we're doing that right now. I'm going to come back to number one in a second. Then we're going to define deflection. Then we're going to talk, of course, about rural considerations in deflection. And as I said, have some Q&A. On the introductions, I'm going to wear two hats. You heard me introduced as the Executive Director of TASC Center for Health and Justice. I also wear a hat as the CEO of PTAC, the Police Treatment and Community Collaborative, which is the national and international voice for deflection. When Sydney and Guy introduce themselves, they'll talk a little bit about the Bureau of Justice Assistance National COSAP TA Center. Next slide, please. Here are our objectives for today of this webinar. Before we get today, you're able to define deflection. State the difference between deflection and diversion, two terms that begin with the letter D that work side by side but are doing things. Understand how deflection fits with prevention and diversion. And then finally, of course, the meat and the heart of the presentation today, state 5 challenges for rural deflection, challenges that, of course, you can overcome, and many of you already have those and are addressing those in the work that you are doing. Next slide, please. If at the end of this webinar today and the work we're going to do together talking about rural deflection, the field of deflection interests you, I invite you to join the national and global deflection conversation. Next slide. PTAC, the Police Treatment and Community Collaborative, as I said, is the national voice of the field. And on the screen right now, you can take a look at some of the items that PTAC does in its role of bringing together all the ways and approaches that deflection happens in the United States and abroad. So no matter what your angle is or your view on it, whether you're doing something more in one space or another, PTAC is that big tent. PTAC created the National Deflection Week, third full week of July. We do standards and accreditation, moving into that if you're a deflection site. The PTAC ticker. Are you receiving the newsletter for our field? If not, sign up for the PTAC ticker. Would you like to be more involved in the field? Connecting with the field highlights different opportunities and ways in which you can engage in deflection, not only your community, but in communities across the United States and indeed with other countries. So this slide gives you a sense of some of the ways that PTAC works as the national voice of the field and ways you can get engaged with the field at large. Next slide. And speaking of engagement, the annual National Summit and International Summit for Deflection is coming up in the first week of December. I invite you to join us as we gather as a field to meet each other, to network, to learn from each other, and to have a good time because, of course, we're going to be in New Orleans. The summit themes are on the right-hand side of your slide, and when you get the slide, you can read through this as well as learn how to register. Again, first week of December, and did I say New Orleans is where we're gathering? Next slide. Some resources that are available to you on the PTAC website. These are free of charge. You don't need to register. In its role, PTAC produces documents for the field. You can click on these when you get the slide deck because they are hyperlinked, or again, just go to the website and pull these down. They're brief. They're 1 to 3 pages, most of them. Some are a little bit longer, and they're designed to be used very simply by sharing with your deflection team, your deflection partners on a variety of topics relevant to the field. Next slide. With PTAC now explained, let's get into one of our first learning objectives is understanding what is deflection. So here's the definition of deflection. I've highlighted two important elements. First is deflection improves public safety. At its heart and core, deflection has a public safety element to it because we know that at times for some people, drug use, misuse, and addiction has linkages to criminal behavior. And we want to be mindful of that. We want to be aware of that so that we can deal with that and ensure that people move on into a place of recovery and well-being so that they no longer have those encounters with law enforcement. The other thing, though, that I want to highlight, which we underline in italics to make sure it stands out very much too, is deflection, if you had to define it in just a few words, is about getting to people as early as possible. Why does that matter? Because we know that in many settings, that the sooner you get to someone, the earlier you get to someone, preferably before anything has started that becomes a problem, the better the outcomes, the quicker the outcomes, the fewer resources that are needed for outcomes. And if I want to break it down to dollar and cents, usually the cheaper it is to deal with people and the things we all encounter in life earlier rather than later, earlier when it is not set in versus later when something, for example, like drug misuse has now moved to drug addiction, or some kind of issue or challenge has moved to the point where now the interventions are going to take much more time, be much more costly, and have more residual effect on the individual, on their family, on children, on the community. So deflection improves public safety, and it's done as early as possible. And while you're reading the deflection, you'll notice that, well, can you go back one slide? One more. While you're reading this slide, you'll notice that we have in higher font people lived experience, peers, clinicians, family members, and crime survivors. Why do we do this? Because while you're getting this presentation today, and many of you might already know about deflection, you'll think of, oh, that's law enforcement and treatment together. And that is absolutely true. We also, though, very much lift up that deflection is not a program. It is a framework of relationships in a community, and we want those relationships, and they need to include people with lived experience. They need to include peers, clinicians, family members, crime survivors, and we could keep going on with the list. So in addition to those that you read up here, we always want to elevate the folks for whom this is not a program. Deflection is not a program. It's a framework of relationships in a community. And each community will have its unique set of relationships that allow us to get to where we need to be, which of course is promotion of recovery from drug use, misuse, and addiction. Now, next slide, please. If I had to now just give you a picture of deflection versus the definition you just had, this is what it would look like. On the left-hand side in green is community, and those two arrows where it says 0 and 1 are arrows that are moving up and out of what's on the right-hand side in gray and orange, which is the justice system. What's the difference between deflection and diversion? One of our learning objectives, if you are pre-filing of charges, on the left-hand side, you are in deflection. If you are post-filing of charges, that's the orange dotted line you see down the middle into the gray and into the orange, you are now into diversion. Deflection and diversion are complements to each other. However, we are here to talk about the left-hand side where 0, that's the SIM, sequential intercept model. If you're familiar with that, it's SIM 0, otherwise known as the community. All the interventions that can happen with law enforcement, with fire, with EMS, with community response, with just outreach workers, that's deflection. Or if you're at number 1, where it says law enforcement, and this is where law enforcement now could be looking at someone that they're going to possibly charge. An arrest might or might not happen, but if it does, that's fine too. And they're going to make the decision, are we going to charge or not? That's also deflection and opens up huge opportunities for you and your community to act. That's often called, by the way, all of this 0 and 1 is deflection, but the one space also is sometimes called pre-arrest deflection or pre-arrest diversion, signaling that there could be an arrest, whereas in 0 and community there was never going to be, but there could be an arrest, and we're going to look to see if deflection options are possible and available for the person. So now you understand the definition of deflection as well as what's the difference between deflection and diversion. Next slide. Here's some more for you to get deeper into what's deflection versus what's diversion. You can read these on your own. The only one that I will highlight right now is addressing the bottom one, left-hand side in deflection, addressing underlying causes of conduct driven by behavioral health challenges. Ultimately, as I said, if you had to find deflection in a few words, you'd say we want to get to people as early as possible. That is the motto of the field of deflection. Why wait for an arrest? Why wait for an overdose? Why wait for a crisis? Because as it says on the bottom left in green, we're trying to get at the underlying causes while people are still in community. Better outcomes for the person, for the family, for our children, for the community, for officers, for treatment, for our resources that are limited everywhere that we go. That bottom green box really says it all. Next slide, please. I'm going to now show you just a few more slides before turning it over to my colleagues. One of these slides is a great visual, a great way to understand deflection. We call it the deflection bridge. But first, next slide. One of our learning objectives was to understand how does prevention, drug prevention is God's work, as I like to say. We should all be doing prevention. And diversion, post-filing into the justice system, prosecutors, courts, jails, probation, parole, prisons. How does that fit with deflection, Jack? I don't get it. So before this idea of deflection, this is how we looked at the world. We had prevention in green in the community, and we had diversion in blue on the right-hand side. Click it once, Guy. Yep. And we had this kind of world that said there's left and right, A and B, 0 and 1, and the two worlds don't meet. But ladies and gentlemen, you know that's not reality. That's not actually how it works. Next slide. So thanks to the introduction of deflection, this is actually now how we see and understand the world. And it actually was like this. We just didn't have a word for it. That word now, and we are celebrating the 10th anniversary this year in 2025 of the introduction of the word deflection, formal introduction through an article that was written in 2015 in Police Chief magazine. We now understand between prevention and diversion, we actually have places to act. We have things we can do, and that is called deflection. And deflection opens up new opportunities for reducing drug use, promoting wellness, promoting recovery, and reducing crime. Very important elements that we talk about. Prevention, deflection, diversion do all fit together, creating this space that we knew was there but didn't have a word for it. Now we do 10 years on, and that word is deflection. Next slide. And as I head to the end of my part of the presentation, I'm going to show you the bridge. Again, this fantastic visual that describes deflection in a picture. I saw when we started off the webinar, people were putting in the communities that they are from. So where it says in green, your community, that's where you would add in the community you're from. So deflection creates a bridge, and this is the deflection visual. In your community, hit it, Guy. We place a bridge. Really common idea, right? There's a bridge. And what is the bridge connecting? Next. It is connecting law enforcement on one side. And by the way, this presentation on deflection that we're doing is centered around the idea of law enforcement deflection. Law enforcement can be done with fire, can be done with EMS, it can be done with second responder workforce, it can be done with community outreach, with the faith community. Anything that fits that definition can be on the left-hand side of the bridge. And on the right-hand side, it says drug treatment. Now, drug treatment is a proxy for treatment, housing, recovery, and services. I want to be clear. You can't write that in that little bar. That's why it just says drug treatment. The point is we are connecting two worlds that historically, prior to deflection, did not have much relationship. And what they did have wasn't a great relationship. But through deflection, we have opened up and created this bridge that now allows law enforcement and drug treatment to be together in the community. Hit it again. The 6 pathways the guy's going to present here in just when I finish this slide. Hit it again. That creates pathways from the community onto the bridge as a result of contact with law enforcement. Hit it again. And then people stay in community. You notice they're not going into jail. They're not going into prison. They're staying in community through the 6 pathways that you'll hear of in a second. All right, Guy, we're going to do a couple more clicks, and then after this slide, we're going to go right to you. So hit it again. Other thing deflection's doing, and you saw this on the title slide, is connecting public safety to public health. 2 more times, and it's connecting the ability to reduce drug use and reduce drug crime. Guy, next slide, and then over to you. And ultimately then, again, deflection leads to recovery from drug use, opening up new ways to reduce drug use and drug-related crime in your community. Thank you, Guy, over to you.
All right. Before we actually get into the 6 pathways, I wanted to address a question in the chat. Now, we are going to have time for questions at the end, but this question I think is important to understand now. So what happens, I believe the question is what happens after the last intercept in that intercept model? That's when it goes back to 0. On screen, the sequential intercept model looks very linear. It's not, it's cyclic. So once we get through the intercepts, it actually starts back over and it keeps going around in a circle. So as far as the deflection pathways go, there's different models, different frameworks on how deflection works. And these are them there. And we're going to go into each one of these somewhat briefly to give you an idea of what they look like. It's very important to understand that these are frameworks, they're pathways, but they are not meant to be rigid. Okay, they seem rigid on paper. They're meant to be very fluid and very flexible. And frankly, each community we work with across the country integrates these pathways, and they always look slightly different. And that's okay. That's almost kind of the point of it. So we start with self-referral. Now, self-referral, it just references the fact that someone is coming to you for assistance. This pathway started in 2015 out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, and it is where the phrase "we can't arrest ourselves out of the problem" comes from. And I'm sure you've heard that in the past. That's where it comes from, this pathway. Basically, how it started was police department being willing to open their doors and say, hey, listen, if you have help and you don't know where to go, you know where the police department is, come to the police department. You need help with treatment, mental health, behavioral health, drug treatment, whatever you need, come here and we will get you connected, either someone coming to the station to help you, or we'll get you a resource and get you connected to the help that you need. And it started in law enforcement, started with a chief of police's idea. It has expanded to safe stations, which are our fire departments. Some communities are very willing to interact with the police department. Other communities are not, and there's probably a spectrum of everywhere in between that. Fire departments is the next logical place to do that. EMS can be involved. It could be a hospital. It could be a community center. It could be anywhere that some place is set up to take in a self-referral, someone coming and saying, I need help, I don't know where to go to. It also has evolved to online forms. Some initial initiatives have a website where you can do an online assessment and get you in, or even a phone call. The emphasis on this is that you really want this to be a warm handoff, which means a face-to-face interaction. I am with you and I'm handing you off to this person who's also with you. The next best thing is a cold handoff, which is phone call or online. Yeah, so that's self-referral in a nutshell.
I think the other thing about self-referral too that I've seen with my grantees is that it oftentimes is the easiest one to implement, at least at first, depending on level of buy-in and your community needs and capacity, but it tends to be an easy one to get off the ground. The first responder and officer referral pathway, this happens during routine activities. So instead of waiting for an arrestable offense, while out on patrol or just while doing their regular duties, law enforcement can use this pathway to proactively refer an individual experiencing substance use disorder or mental health crises to services, like Jack was mentioning earlier, like a treatment provider or a case manager. These initiatives can be led by any first responder agency, but 75% of them are led by law enforcement. So where the initiatives are led by law enforcement, there's no arrest made. And if it is led by fire or EMS, then these referrals can happen on their routine calls for services as well, or where they're out in the community. The nice thing about this pathway, and I think a good talking point when you're trying to get buy-in with law enforcement, is that it offers a tool for law enforcement officers while they're out on patrol to respond to substance use disorder and mental health issues when there are no charges present, instead of them just having to leave the person.
All right, the next pathway started as naloxone plus. There is a push to kind of refer to this as a post-overdose response because that's really what it is. The idea behind naloxone plus is we provided naloxone, now we're adding additional resources. And this is when a non-fatal overdose happens. We respond to the non-fatal overdose and we follow up with treatment and services. And that follow-up could be immediate. A team could show up to the scene of an overdose. It could be very shortly after, almost immediate at the hospital. It could be the next morning. The important thing is this golden window of time from immediate to 72 hours of this person is probably now realizing it's not an abstract thought of, yeah, I use drugs there, I could overdose. It's, I did overdose and I almost died. So we want to catch them in that mind state of perhaps a bit more willing to take treatment. Where this started, which really what I love about it was, it's a multidisciplinary team. It could be law enforcement, fire, EMS, someone that knows the overdose happened, someone that has that access to this data. But one of the most important people in this is a treatment provider or someone from the public health side. And like I said, where it started was they would go cold call someone at their house after an overdose and knock on the door and say, hey, listen, you recognize us. We just Narcaned you. We saved your life. We have a treatment provider with us right now. If you're willing to come with us, she can get you into a treatment facility right now. That's the way it started. It doesn't mean that's the only possibility of this. It could be going to the hospital and just providing resources. Because again, we are meeting these people where they are. So if they're not ready to go into treatment right away, that's fine. Here's resources. Here's some harm reduction. Here's our card. We're here whenever you're ready. So that's really what this pathway is about. It can work very well in rural communities, as does self-referral and officer referral. The picture that I included in this, one, there's not a chance that I'm going to have a presentation and not include a picture of myself. I was former law enforcement, and this is me bending down giving Narcan. But what I really love about this picture, it highlights a traditional or a past response from officers and a more modern response. You have the officer standing up, looking, waiting for the ambulance to come in, taking information. And that was a traditional police response to this. And then you have another officer carrying Narcan, administering a bit more non-traditional law enforcement activities. And I think that it's a really cool picture to include in this. And the next one is active outreach, and I'll hand it over to Sydney.
So no specific event is required for this pathway. Either first responders, either on a co-response team or a multidisciplinary team, will seek out individuals and then initiate linkages to treatment, resources to meet basic needs, and provide information about support services. So the primary goal of this pathway is to identify and reach people before they have an overdose or before they're exposed to the criminal legal system. These teams can be made up of a lot of different organizations or agencies, similar to what Guy was mentioning before. Teams that we've seen with grantees can include clinicians, peers, first responders. Really, at the end of the day, again, it's really dependent on the community, on your capacity, on buy-in, and what your community needs.
Also with this, if you look at this picture, one of the other people that you can involve in this, and specifically can be very beneficial to rural communities where capacity is a bit low, is volunteers. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but the picture of the woman in this car is a community volunteer. Okay, the officer intervention pathway. This is where Jack was talking about sometime before charges are filed or before the court process. This is where your district attorney must be involved because it is a poster in that process to where it's got a bit more teeth. It's okay, we maybe have given you a ticket for this, and before arraignment or before a hearing or sometime in that process, we are introducing some type of intervention to where, listen, we have an opportunity to get you to treatment. And if you finish this treatment, this case won't go any further. It could also be at the officer level to where the officer goes up and says, listen, I have 2 years to charge you with this simple possession. Or you can go to treatment and we'll keep track of you. And if you do successful, I won't file the charges. This one has a bit more teeth to it. It can be voluntary. It can be a little bit more non-voluntary, while the other pathways are very voluntary. They're only voluntary.
Okay, community response. This is where a team will engage an individual oftentimes to help de-escalate crisis, mediate some low-level conflicts, address quality of life issues, and of course, provide referral to treatment, services, case manager, any type of recovery resource. Again, team members here can include a variety of different folks depending on your community needs, but it can include crisis workers, clinicians, peers, medical professionals, and others. These teams are often dispatched through 911, 988. They can also be just community-based referrals, which would be through a software system or through a phone call, sometimes an email. Whatever works for your community and whatever works for the folks providing that data is ultimately what's going to be best. And next slide, guys.
Yeah, one more thing on community response. You heard Jack say secondary response or second response. We all know what first responders are. This pathway has started to be recognized by calling the people that are responding to this as a second response or second responders, which I think is actually a really cool way to delineate between the two. Onto specific rural deflection ideas or considerations. And we're going to go over a bunch of different topics. These are the topics. The first one is access to treatment and follow-up care. When we talk to some challenges with rural, they can be the same challenges in other communities, urban communities, suburban communities, but they're much more highlighted in rural communities because, I mean, the definition of rural is there's less people in your community. With that, service locations is an issue, but even more beyond that, one of the biggest issues is capacity. And when we talk about capacity, the way I like to describe it is the amount of options, maybe not enough staff, limited resources, beds that maybe just aren't available. If you take an example from like New York City, I'm based out of New York, so I'm going to give you a bunch of New York references. Based in New York City, you're someone in need and you're standing on pretty much any corner in New York City, you probably have a bunch of options, inpatient, 12-step programs, outpatient, all kinds of things. And they're probably in walking distance. And if not, there's tons of public transportation to get you there. In rural communities, it's almost the complete opposite. There's many initiatives we work with that have zero inpatient options. And maybe the inpatient option is one inpatient option outside the county, which brings up some concerns with capacity in that one inpatient facility because now they're servicing 2 counties. So beds might even be more scarce. That brings us to location. A lot of these communities are spread out. The population's a bit more spread out. And the services provided tend to be somewhat centrally located, which seems like a good idea. And it's really the best case option for that community. But that doesn't really help someone who's on the outskirts or farther away. Getting to a treatment facility that takes you a half hour, 40 minutes to get to, you're going to maybe 2 times a week, once a week, whatever it is, can become a little bit cumbersome and a bit of a drain, and maybe even be something that makes the person go, you know what, maybe I don't even want to do this anymore. So capacity locations are huge issues with this. And that's where understanding the community landscape comes in. Knowing what your community solutions are, doing a mapping of what your resources are. And also what comes along with this is partnership and planning. Partnership is probably one of the most important things to consider in any initiative. It becomes more intentional, the need for it to be more intentional when you're talking about rural communities, because just the lack of resources. And that also, like I said, brings up transportation issues. New York City has tons of public transportation available. Rural communities, not so much. And they might not even service the entire county. Let's say we're talking about a county. The cost of transportation, having to maybe bother a friend to get you there every day. So there's a lot of issues around that. But like I said, with partnership and planning, when we talk about partnership, we have certain critical elements to deflection, and partnership is always the first one. Creating partners with faith-based communities, community groups, school anti-drug groups, the DA's office, law enforcement, and trying to pool resources is really important in this space. To give you an example, this photo is from Rockefeller Institute of Government. They did a study back in 2018 on rural deflection. And if you're interested, it's the Stories of Sullivan. You can look it up. They have a lot of unique insight here. But what's important about or interesting about this photo is that yellow triangle. Now, this is Sullivan County, which is in New York. It's about an hour and a half from New York City, north of New York City. It's the size of Rhode Island. and it's a very rural community. To give you an example, if you see Bethel on there, that's Woodstock. So if you're familiar with Woodstock and what that looked like in farming and everything, that's this community. And it really hasn't changed very much since the 60s. That triangle is where all the resources are. The treatment resources, which are limited, but also on top of that's where the grocery stores are, that's where the pharmacies are, that's where the doctor's offices are. So to get from somewhere on the southwest side like Eldred and going into this triangle of resources every day, every week, can become a bit challenging. Sydney?
So similar to what Guy said, stigma exists in all communities, right? And all of the issues that we're talking about, or all of the considerations that we're talking about, exist in all communities. It just shows up differently in different communities. Stigma in rural communities sometimes can feel more overwhelming, I think, for people with substance use disorder because of that lack of anonymity. In other words, everybody knows each other's business. So for example, I'm from Minnesota originally, and when I go home, I get an in-depth update on all of my parents' neighbors and their children and what all of them are up to. Meanwhile, I live in Chicago in an apartment complex. I've lived here for 2 years, and I don't know a single one of my neighbors' names. So in rural communities, word travels fast. I was just meeting with a grantee yesterday, actually, who was trying to get a rural police department on board with their initiative. And even the law enforcement officers were saying people don't want to accept help because we all know each other. All of our kids go to school together. They don't want to talk to us about substance use disorder. There can also be less of a cultural acceptance for treatment, maybe less awareness about alternatives to arrest and incarceration. And again, that's present in a lot of communities. And really the antidote to that is outreach and education and training. And as I mentioned, this perspective is present in the general population, but that also translates to first responders too. So to combat that level of stigma within the first responders or within agencies that you're working at, again, community education, training, outreach work, that's the best way to combat stigma in these communities and in communities in general.
Yeah, in addition to that, when we're talking about stigma, it's important to know your community and know what your community is like. I used to work in a community that was more kind of suburban, had neighborhoods, but also combined with farms, dairy farms and produce farms and all kinds of farms. And the different types of mindset with people moving up from the city to go to the suburbs, but also being in a community of farmers, it can be very tricky. And I know specifically of an example that I'll give of a farmer who I knew who was in a mindset of not putting money in a bank, putting money under the mattress, and even burying their money in a can in the back, in their farm. But take that mindset of set in their ways and kind of not wanting to change, and people coming up from the city where there's tons of resources and stigma might not be as much of an issue. They can sometimes be at odds, and it can be very tricky to get them both on the same page. And that's why it's really important to know what your community landscape is in terms of where they are, so you can actually meet them where they are. Because you might need to meet a more traditional rural population a little bit differently than someone in the urban environment or someone a bit more progressive ideas. Also with rural deflection, especially with stigma, is finding interesting solutions and out-of-the-box solutions. And I'm going to play a short video, and it is short. It's from Rockefeller Institute of Government.
My name is Julie Pizzol, and I am the co-founder of the Kingfisher Project here at WJFF radio station. One of the things that we wanted to do was reduce the stigma, because 5 years ago, nobody was talking about it. And it seems now, even though the problem seems to be getting worse, more people are talking about it, and there's becoming more solutions. We've had the DA, we've had the sheriff, we've had family members, we've had people who are in recovery, we've had people who are not in recovery. I hope people get out of our show that there is hope for them. There is hope for someone who is struggling with addiction. And I hope they know that they are not alone, that there are other people who are suffering. And I hope that they also know that there are services available, and they're becoming more and more, and that family members need to talk about it more, talk about and raise awareness. And I hope the family members also know that they are not alone.
Actually, I'll get to that in a minute. So we talked a little bit about capacity and the limited capacity usually in rural communities. What this really takes, and we hinted at it before, is intentional planning. Getting an organized, well-established planning session, action planning, can be very beneficial when you get partners from all over the county in the same room, identify what your problems are, identify what the potential solutions are, what outcomes you would like to get out of that. That's really where this can be very beneficial, or that can be very beneficial to rural communities. It's beneficial to every community, but really beneficial in rural communities. You really got to plan for success and intentional planning. Gaining cooperation from different groups, working with your neighbors, knowing your neighbors, involving. A lot of times when we're talking about capacity issues, it's a workforce issue, limited employees, maybe having to train employees that aren't as trained. What's important with this, and why the training is important, is in larger communities, you can be more specialized. In more rural communities, it's nice to be specialized in something, but you will have to be more of a generalist. I give an example of, I was a detective sergeant and I'm dealing with investigations and heading up investigations and supervising investigators. And I'm also doing deflection work. And I find myself in a training on Medicare, on how to get people on Medicare for treatment. Something I thought I would be involved with, but because I worked in a community where it was a bit more rural, I had to have a wide range of knowledge in many different areas. It really doesn't work. It de-emphasizes specialization. And let's see. Oh, the example I wanted to give was larger police departments. So larger police departments, New York City, someone comes into a police department and says, my car was hit last night, parked on the road. I need to make a report. Awesome. I have a whole unit for that. I'm going to send you to them. That's all they deal with. Another person comes in. I need an accident report. Awesome. Our records department, they're specialized in that. You go to them, they'll handle it. Another person comes in and says, someone broke into my house. Oh, we have a major crimes. That's what they deal with. We'll give you to them. That is impossible in smaller PDs. And in fact, most smaller PDs, you don't even have units. You have the officer who has to be trained in all of these things. When you're dealing with initiatives with deflection, that's where you have to lie. That's where you have to be. You have to wear multiple hats. You have to be a jack of all trades. That does bring issues with staffing shortages, which is a national issue with this. But with that, since you're wearing so many different hats, you're doing so many different things, burnout is also an issue. Initiatives having planning for self-care and taking care of your employees is also very important. When we're looking for solutions with this, especially staffing issues, often overlooked, and I mentioned it before, is volunteers. So I worked with an organization up in New York, and when we started, there was no paid employees, and we had 500 community volunteers. And these are parents, sisters, brothers, friends that are looking for a way to help, and they just don't know how. And these, unfortunately, are a very untapped resource in this. There's ways to make that volunteer sustainable. It's a bit more challenging. But with deflection in rural areas, you have to think outside the box. You have to come up with groupthink ideas and go for maybe the non-traditional type of solutions. But partnerships, again, not to overstate it, partnerships and planning is huge. One of the big things with rural communities can also be siloing, which can kill initiatives. The more you can get in touch with and partner with and plan and make other organizations part of your planning, not just, hey, here's what we're doing, you want to join us. Getting them to the table and being a part of the planning, the better outcomes you can come across. And I will give it right back to Sydney.
So initially, when I was planning the presentation, I listed out workforce challenges in rural communities. But after we talked more about it, I feel like everybody on this call probably knows what their workforce challenges are. I'm sure a lot of you have many of them in common, and in urban communities, people are experiencing the same thing. It's difficult to hire and it's difficult to find good qualified people for these roles to fill. So instead, we're going to talk about solutions to these challenges. And as we've been saying throughout the whole presentation, it's important to remember that there's not a one size fits all solution. Each community, each deflection initiative, each organization is different, and all of the people that you're serving are different with different needs. And it's important to keep all of that in mind. So the first idea or first solution is providing more incentives when you're hiring. So for example, I have one grantee who provides living stipends for certain expenses such as rent for their peer recovery coaches. They're in rural Wisconsin. So that's one example, but it's good to think about, as Guy was saying, other creative, out of the box ideas to incentivize people to move to your community or even just to relocate within your area. Maybe they're not coming from out of state, but maybe they're coming from just a neighboring community. But you can provide those living stipends that I mentioned. Maybe you have some benefits that you could offer, childcare, work from home options, any other type of like creative benefit that you can offer that just sweetens the deal a little bit for people who are looking for a job. Virtual services, since COVID, there's a lot of organizations offering virtual services now. There's telehealth, there's SUD assessments that you can do virtually, and even peer support organizations where you can access a peer 24/7. In a lot of states, that's an available service as well. I know for sure there's one in Washington called Boulder Care, and that's an app and also I believe a website, and people can log on and access peer support anytime. As Guy was saying, volunteers or interns is also a really good option. Again, you have to think about the sustainability of that. But for example, I have one grantee who works with their local community college. So they always have a pool of candidates from the behavioral health program at that local college. So a little bit of sustainability in that sense. But you can also do interns from like local high school, community centers, and things that I've seen interns or volunteers do with some of my grantees are putting together like infographics, helping create training or education for community events or first responders. I've also even seen interns or fellows even from local colleges help with like data, research, evaluation, and other ideas. You can use contractors or part-time workers to fill any gaps that you might have. Maybe it's too difficult to find somebody full-time, but you can find a part-time worker. Also being flexible with qualifications and with job descriptions. Being flexible in deflection initiatives in general is always best. And I think you have to be flexible and you have to be creative. But even with hiring and job descriptions, you need to be flexible and creative there as well. So I have one grantee also in rural Wisconsin. They were trying to hire a social worker for their co-response team. And they just weren't getting any bites. They had the job posted for a while. Nobody was applying. So instead, I worked with them to change that job description instead to a coordinated response specialist is what we ended up calling it. They didn't need a social worker license, and they ended up hiring for that role. And somebody is starting, I think actually yesterday they started. But it was pretty quick once they changed that job description and just changed the qualifications a little bit. The person is still going to be doing a lot of the same work. It's just a different qualification. And partnerships, as we've been saying this entire time, partnerships, working together with neighboring communities, sharing resources, pooling resources, very important.
Yeah, I think also not overlooking certain partners. Faith-based partners sometimes get overlooked. It is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Domestic violence organizations get overlooked. They deal a lot in this space as well. Community groups, student groups, any partner you can make. It's a lot of times we look for big solutions and we ignore simple or smaller solutions, when a lot of the smaller solutions grouped together can turn into a big solution and really help your community, as well as volunteers. I'm a big fan of volunteers, that just because that's where I come from. So let's talk about funding. Obviously, the one thing I'm going to tell you is look for grants. What a silly thing to say. Of course, you know how to look for grants. That's what you're doing. You're looking for grants. More importantly is knowing how the money will help your community, looking for the grants that will actually help your community. What type of grants, what type of money, what type of resources you need. And of course, this is the first thing we look for. Okay, we need a grant to sustain this. And to sustain it, you really do need some kind of income. But to get it started, you might not need as much as you think. The initiative I was a part of, we had zero funding. We had zero funding when we started. And what we did was we held a kayak race for funding. We held another fundraiser for funding. And we relied on donations as well. And that's another thing that sometimes gets overlooked. People are willing to help. Maybe they don't want to do it with their time, but they do want to do it with their money. If you're working with police departments, let's say in a self-referral, trying to get the police department to fund, hey, listen, this police department's going to fund our rack cards or our promotional material, and this department's going to fund transportation costs or things like that. So getting creative, not overlooking smaller solutions to funding is important. What's interesting now, and we're starting to see, which is a really good, intelligent way to do it, is there are grants and funding opportunities that police departments have that maybe benefit public safety, but also public health. So perhaps a police department gets a public safety grant, and we can use it in their initiative because it's benefiting public health. Crime reduction is one of them. Crime reduction with deflection benefits public health and public safety. And vice versa. Public health grants that maybe a hospital can get or a treatment facility might be able to get that might be able to be used towards more public safety initiatives. So thinking outside the box and using it in a very creative way is very important. And as you've gotten from what we've said, the ability to think outside the box, wear different hats, and have different types of knowledge is hugely important in the more rural you get. Data tracking is important. Data tracking in the beginning to get buy-in is huge, and we have research now on deflection that's very positive: crime reduction, reduce recidivism, reduce overdoses, all kinds of things. And that's great for getting buy-in. Where data tracking with your initiative comes in is to get funding or to sustain funding. This is where you go to your senators or county executives and go, listen, we would want some money for this initiative we're doing. And the next question you get is, how effective is it? Here's how effective it is. This is what we've done with limited or no resources. So that's also very important with this. Multiple streams of income, all these little types of income. And then you talk about sustainability with blending or braiding and your funds. And braiding your funds basically just means this stream is going to be blended with this stream of funding. And at the end of it, when we're ready to report, we can unbraid them and get the proper information to the proper sources. Blending is just, we're throwing all this money into a pool and we're going to use it for whatever we want. Different types of situations call for different either blending or braiding, and that leads to sustainability. And Sydney?
So today we explained what deflection is, what the difference between deflection and diversion is, and we reviewed the 6 pathways of deflection. We also explored what deflection looks like in rural communities with a focus on those 5 considerations that we discussed, and examples that we see within our own grantees and with our communities that we both live in. As a reminder, the PTAC conference is in New Orleans this year, December 2nd through the 4th, and registration is currently open. Myself, Guy, and Jack will all be there. So we hope to see you to celebrate the 10th anniversary of deflection.
Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Amy to lead some Q&A.
All right. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time and the information. It's been very informative, and appreciate Jack and Guy and Cindy for providing that. We really appreciate the insights. We would now like to open the floor to questions. So you feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I know there was one question, I think Guy, you had answered that already about diversion number 5. So while you're putting your questions in the chat, I'll just do a couple that kind of came to mind for me. So one of the things, working in the field of substance abuse and trying to create recovery ecosystems, which would involve deflection programs, I know you just mentioned the really importance of funding. So is there a specific place that you would recommend that we go to look for grants to start deflection programs? Is there a good spot for that?
Government shutdown aside, we are expecting a solicitation for the COSUP grant. COSUP grant through the Bureau of Justice Assistance can provide significant funding. So if you look for that, that's one of them. There is it just came out in September from the White House direction or from the federal government that is funding for specifically rural communities. And it's something like $50 billion of money. And it's only for states to put in, but it's something to put on your politicians' radar because it's a significant amount of money that states can receive specifically for rural funding. Jack, Sydney, do you have any ideas for?
I do. Yeah, the federal government aside, and that's just because the federal government is only mostly going to initiate stuff. They're not going to sustain or allow you to grow anything because that's not the design of it. When you are looking at either existing operations or new operations that will fund outreach workers, peers, people with lived experience, what you want to do is build into that proposal contact with law enforcement, contact with fire and EMS, and lo and behold, you have now built a deflection proposal. In other words, you might not find the COSIP deflection funding stream. Instead, you're finding something especially focused on SUD, outreach workers, peers, and just build that and say, as part of our partnerships, we will build that with our local law enforcement. That is going over better and better and better. 10 years ago, that would not have been accepted. Now it is more and more understood that those relationships, like the deflection bridge, working together through funding streams matters and makes a difference to your foundations that are in your area and to governments that want bang for buck proposition.
I would also look at opioid settlement funds in your community as well. Those are always a good resource. And I did put
Go ahead,
links
Cindy.
sorry, Amy, I put links to the funding opportunities that we were talking about for BJA, their current available funding opportunities, and the rural health funding as well.
Thank you. I know we had someone that had a question during your presentation, so I'd like to turn the time over to them to ask their question. I think.
Yeah, that is to Corey. I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name. Juhat. You should be allowed to speak now. You can unmute if you want to ask your question.
It's been a little bit, so he may have gotten sidetracked.
Yeah, you may have.
Yeah, and I think that may have dropped off. So maybe you can move on with the other questions.
Okay. So it looks like we got time for one more question. So one question that comes to mind for me, working in the rural state of Idaho in particular, and I'm sure this is true in most rural states, is how do you get buy-in within the criminal justice system? So we looked at creating a deflection program. You talked about bringing together community partners, and we had a great time bringing together like treatment providers, those types of things, but we had a really hard time with the prosecuting attorneys, the court systems. Any suggestions on how to get some buy-in from those folks?
Yeah, I would throw out there that so my role in my past initiative was law enforcement liaison, and it was specifically designed with officer buy-in and chief buy-in or administrator buy-in. The first thing I always had to get around was this isn't a non-police solution. This isn't some community solution that's going to tell the police how they're to do their job. And law enforcement is also a group where it's somewhat set in their ways, and you do have to meet them where they are. So having conversations and explaining the history of law enforcement and how deflection fits with law enforcement goals. And I don't have time to get into it here, but deflection is really where law enforcement started. And only up until the war on drugs in 1971 did it change a bit. But if you look at the history of law enforcement prior to that, it emphasized treatment over arrest. And many of the police leaders are on record stating that drug use or addiction will never be a police problem, and it's specifically in the public health realm. With us with law enforcement to assist in that role because there is crossover. Jack, did you have something else?
I did three very quick technical systems. No matter where it is in regards to something new, right? Deflection is something new for some people. 10 years old is young. Number one, bring in their peers. Are there peers in your state in rural communities where this is happening? Can you use a peer-to-peer network, right? Peers apply to everybody in every profession. Nobody's unique on this. Number one, we will bring in peers. If we need to bring in folks from other states or nationally, we'll do that too, but often they'll be from similar communities. So peers is number one. Number two is it's new, 10 years is about second grade, right? So deflections in about second grade, as I like to say. Number two is do awareness and education lunches. Buy people lunch. I'm being funny, but I'm not. Buy people lunch and do these one-on-one sessions with them. Third approach that we take on this is either go, and it's either way, or you can do both, is go to your judges. So I'm not saying prosecutors or police, go to your judges. Why? Because judges have what we call convening power. They are different in along all the other justice entities that exist. Police, prosecutors, wardens, sheriffs, they have convening power. When a judge says, come to my courtroom, we're going to have a conversation, and it's not about a case, people usually show up. So we do look at judges as anchors in community for all sorts of justice initiatives. Now, the courts are not formally involved in deflection. However, when you find a judge, they call the police chiefs will show up. Others will appear. And so that is a very kind of learned lesson. The corollary to that on the community side is civic and faith leaders who are engaged. They often have a personal story, can be equally powerful. So those are three specific tactics or strategies we use on the technical assistance side when we're advancing any kind of justice work, not limited to deflection.
Yeah, I also think, training law enforcement as well, training in ACEs or childhood trauma, which we didn't have time to get into, but is a connection there. Explaining the link between substance use and drug use, substance use and crime, and the criminogenic nature in that, and showing it as a crime reduction tool, because it is. Deflection is a crime reduction tool. It also has public health benefits. But like Jack was saying, find your partners and finding that champion within law enforcement who can speak law enforcement's language as a peer is crucial.
All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time, and we appreciate all that have joined us today. I feel like I learned a lot. I think we really got a lot out of your presentation. We would just remind everyone that please remember to take the survey with the webinar when you get that. And it helps us to know how we can make these better and what topics that you might want to understand better. We will be posting this to our webinar page, and I put that in the chat there. Please feel free to go back and take a look at that along with a copy of the slides. And don't forget to sign up for our next month's webinar. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.